It was a dreary, gray morning in the town of Dewdale when Detective Henri Mareau received an urgent summons from the imposing hilltop estate of Mrs. Winifred Winkle, one of the town's wealthiest and most cantankerous residents. Mareau sighed as he donned his hat and coat. Another day, another petty crime to solve. Such was the life of the only detective in a small country town. As his carriage clattered up the long gravel drive leading to the Winkle mansion, Mareau noticed all the curtains were drawn despite the early hour. How very like the reclusive widow to shut out all natural light, he mused. A timid maid greeted him at the door and ushered him into the lavish drawing room where Mrs. Winkle awaited, fuming in an ornate armchair. "Well, it's about time you got here," she snapped by way of greeting. "I've been robbed." Mareau removed his hat and bowed slightly. "My apologies for the delay, madam. I came as soon as I received word. Now, what exactly has been stolen?" Mrs. Winkle gestured dramatically to an empty space on the wood-paneled wall above the fireplace mantel. "My painting, of course. An original work, purchased at great expense from an auction in the city. I want you to find the scoundrel who took it and see that they are punished to the full extent of the law." The detective stepped closer to examine the scene of the crime. The painting had been expertly cut from its frame, leaving no trace behind. No other artwork or valuables in the room appeared to have been disturbed. "How very odd. I shall do my best to recover your property, Mrs. Winkle. Have you any notion of who may have perpetrated this theft? A servant, perhaps? Or an acquaintance with knowledge of the painting's worth?" "Certainly not." Mrs. Winkle looked scandalized by the very suggestion. "I'll have you know I keep my staff on a very tight leash, and I can assure you, I do not associate with anyone of low enough character to commit such an act." Mareau jotted a note in his little black book, careful to keep his expression neutral. Best not to point out that literally everyone in town had motive to steal from the widely despised widow. "Very well. I shall begin my investigation at once. Good day, madam." After a thorough search of the estate turned up no clues, Mareau decided to take a different approach. He strolled down the main street of Dewdale, greeting the townspeople as he made his way to the Bountiful Bean, the most popular coffee house in the village. If anyone had heard whispers about the burglary, this would be the place. "Why, Detective Mareau, how good to see you," called out the cafe owner, Barnaby Barrington, as Mareau entered. "The usual, I presume?" "Indeed. Thank you, Barnaby." Mareau settled himself at a table by the window and retrieved a dog-eared file from his satchel. It contained old newspaper clippings about headline-grabbing art thefts in the city. Perhaps there would be a detail that connected to the Winkle case. As he sipped his coffee and pored over the yellowed articles, a name jumped out at him from the pages: Alicia Fairclough. According to the write-up, she had been a famous stage actress and singer nearly a century ago. And the grainy photo printed alongside showed a woman with an uncanny resemblance to the one in the missing Winkle painting. Coincidence? Mareau thought not. The tinkling of the bell above the door drew his attention, and he glanced up to see old Tom, the town's carpenter and handyman, enter the shop. Tom caught his eye and nodded in greeting before placing his order. Mareau noticed the old man seemed tired and distracted, lacking his usual cheery air. He beckoned Tom over. "Join me for a moment, won't you? I'd like to pick your brain about something." Tom hesitated, then pulled out the chair opposite and sat. "What can I do for you, detective?" Mareau leaned forward, his voice low. "Mrs. Winkle was robbed last night. The thief made off with a valuable painting. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Tom's weathered face paled and he broke eye contact. "Me? No, I don't know nothing about any stolen paintings. I was home all night. I swear it." The detective regarded him thoughtfully. Tom had always been an upstanding, honest fellow, but he also had more reason than most to hold a grudge against Mrs. Winkle. The widow had a habit of hiring Tom for repairs and renovations on her estate, then refusing to pay him. Desperation could drive even the most ethical man to commit crimes. "Relax, Tom. I'm not accusing you of anything," Mareau said gently. "I'm just trying to gather information. The painting that was taken, you see, bears a remarkable likeness to your late wife, Eliza. That couldn't be a coincidence, could it?" Tom's eyes widened. Eliza? I didn't realize. He trailed off, clearly flustered. Mareau pressed on. Eliza's maiden name was Fairclough, wasn't it? Any relation to Alicia Fairclough, the famous actress? The old carpenter nodded slowly. Her great-grandmother, I believe. Eliza didn't talk about her much. Just said she got her looks and her voice from her. And the song you're always singing under your breath, "Oh My Country, Oh My Heart," that was one of Alicia's famous tunes, wasn't it? Tom passed a shaky hand over his face. It was Eliza's favorite. We used to sing it together. His voice cracked with emotion. Oh, detective, you have to understand. When I saw that painting in Winkle's house, it was like seeing a ghost. Like my Eliza had come back to me. I couldn't bear the thought of that which having it, mistreating it like she did Eliza when she worked as a maid there. Mrs. Winkle made her life miserable, you know. I needed to have a piece of my wife back. Mareau sighed heavily. He understood the ache of loss all too well. How many nights had he lain awake, staring at the empty space in the bed beside him, wishing for his own lost love to return. But he also had a duty to uphold the law. He fixed Tom with a stern look. I'm going to need you to return the painting, Tom. You know that, don't you? The old man hung his head, tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. I know. I knew it the moment I took it. I miss her so much. Of course you do. But keeping that painting wouldn't have brought Eliza back. And it's not what she would have wanted for you. Mareau reached across the table and gripped Tom's shoulder. We'll go see Mrs. Winkle together. Make this right. I'll do everything I can to persuade her not to press charges. Tom met his gaze. You're a good man, Detective Mareau. I'm sorry for the trouble I've caused. The two men finished their coffee in contemplative silence, then made their way to the Winkle estate. The lady of the house was predictably outraged when Mareau informed her that her painting had been recovered, and even more so when he gingerly suggested she drop the matter. Drop the matter? Drop the matter. Mrs. Winkle's voice reached a decibel that made Mareau wince. I've been robbed, burgled, pilfered, and you expect me to simply let it go. I'm merely proposing an alternate solution, Mareau said calmly. Mr. Weaver has agreed to return the painting immediately and make full restitution for any damages incurred. Pursuing legal action would only prolong the situation unnecessarily. Mrs. Winkle huffed and puffed, clearly torn between her desire for vengeance and the notion of putting the unpleasantness behind her as quickly as possible. At last she threw up her hands. Oh, very well. I suppose I can be lenient this once, seeing as you did manage to retrieve my property. But mark my words, if anything like this happens again, I will not be so forgiving. Understood, madam. Mareau tipped his hat. I thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Weaver. Tom stepped forward, the painting tucked under his arm, his expression a mix of shame and relief. My deepest apologies, Mrs. Winkle. I don't know what came over me. It won't happen again. See that it doesn't, she sniffed. Fetch my footman to rehang the painting. And mind you do a better job than you did fixing that squeaky floorboard in the study. It still groans something awful. With that, she turned on her heel and flounced out of the room, leaving the two men to stare after her retreating form. That went better than I expected, Mareau said wryly. I'll say. I figured she'd have me clapped in irons for sure. Tom ran a hand through his thinning hair. I don't know how to thank you, detective, for everything. Just stay out of trouble. That's all the thanks I need. Mareau clapped him on the back as they exited the house and made their way down the drive. And Tom, next time you're missing Eliza, come have a coffee with me. I'm always happy to lend an ear. Tom nodded, his eyes misty. I just might take you up on that. As they reached the road, a thought occurred to Mareau. Say, what were you doing at the cafe this morning? Anyway, you're not usually one for socializing. The old carpenter stopped short and rubbed the back of his neck. Well, now about that. I was on my way to see you, tell you everything, but I lost my nerve. Figured you were better off not knowing. Mareau chuckled. And here I thought I had deduced the truth using my keenly honed investigative skills. I suppose even the best of us need a little luck sometimes." They parted ways with a handshake and a promise to meet for coffee again soon. As Mareau watched Tom amble down the lane, a spring in his step that hadn't been there for quite some time, the detective allowed himself a small smile. He may not have been able to give the lonely widower back his beloved wife, but perhaps he had helped him find a little peace. And in a world full of Mrs. Winkles, Mareau reflected, that was no small accomplishment indeed. Over the next few weeks, Dewdale settled back into its usual sleepy routine. The Fairclough painting was restored to its place of honor above Mrs. Winkle's mantelpiece, and if the lady of the house kept a closer eye on her domestic staff and her possessions, she at least refrained from any further tirades. True to his word, Old Tom began joining Detective Mareau for coffee at the Bountiful Bean every Tuesday and Thursday morning. They spoke of Eliza, of course, and of Tom's younger days roaming the countryside in search of work, and of Mareau's past triumphs and failures on the job. But they also spoke of books and music and the changing of the seasons, and found in each other the sort of easy companionship that can only come from shared loss and mutual understanding. Mareau continued to ply his trade, solving the odd petty theft or marital dispute, but his thoughts kept returning to the unlikely friendship he had forged with the carpenter. He couldn't help but feel that, in helping Tom come to terms with his grief, he had also begun to heal some of the wounds left by his own wife's abandonment. It was on a crisp autumn afternoon, as he and Tom sat sipping cider on the old man's porch and watching the leaves float down from the ancient oak tree in the yard, that Mareau finally gave voice to the idea that had been percolating in his mind. "You know, Tom, I've been thinking. I'm not as young as I used to be, and this sleuthing business is starting to wear on me. What would you say to coming to work with me as my partner? Lord knows I could use an assistant, and your skills would be invaluable in my line of work." Tom was silent for so long that Mareau began to fear he had overstepped. But then the old man turned to him with shining eyes and said, "I'd be honored, Henri. Truly. I think Eliza would have liked that. She always said I spent too much time alone in my workshop." They shook on it, and a new chapter began for them both. The detective and the carpenter, the city-educated lawman and the country handyman, made for an unlikely duo. But they quickly earned a reputation as the keenest crime-solving team in the county. Mareau's deductive prowess combined with Tom's knowledge of the townspeople and his gift for subterfuge proved to be a formidable force. Dewdale was not suddenly transformed into a hotbed of criminal activity, of course. But when the Widow Winkle's prize rose bushes were vandalized, or when old Farmer McCoy's prize goat went missing, the citizens knew just who to call. And if Mareau and Tom occasionally let a young ne'er-do-well off with a warning rather than a stint in jail, or slipped a few extra coins to a struggling family, well, everyone agreed the town was better for it. Even Mrs. Winkle was heard to remark on more than one occasion that the pair of them were not entirely without merit. High praise indeed. For their part, Mareau and Tom found a contentment in their shared purpose that neither had known for a long time. The detective began to look forward to their morning coffee chats as much as he did the thrill of the chase, and Tom took to keeping Eliza's portrait on the wall of their office as a reminder of what had brought them together. It was a strange sort of happily ever after for two men who had resigned themselves to living out their days alone. But as they sat together on the porch each evening, watching the stars wink into view in the velvet sky, Mareau reflected that there were far worse fates than ending up an old bachelor in a town full of friends. After all, he had learned, love comes in many forms, and sometimes the most unexpected ones are the most precious of all.